Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Isaac Clarke, and this is Capricorn, and I cannot keep this up for a full video. No way. Anyway, happy Halloween, everybody. It is Halloween day, and I'm coming at you with another spoiler video for Foundations. Today's spoilers are looking pretty crazy. This is a wrap-up video for days 6 and 7, so the end of the first week of spoilers, essentially. And things are looking pretty crazy, so we're going to jump right into the cards. Before we do, make sure to give this video a like so you can help me get it out to more people, help the channel grow. I would appreciate it so much. And subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload. Tons more spoiler content and some crazy deck techs coming down the line, so look forward to that. Also, if you want to see more of Isaac Clarke, I am doing a Halloween stream tonight over on Twitch. It's a community night, so I'm playing games of MTG Arena against you guys all night long. I've got a bowl full of candy, I've got the Isaac Clarke helmet, I've got a few surprises in store. It's going to be a good time, so I'll see you there. That's twitch.tv/quarantinedcapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Now let's jump into the cards. First off, we have Abyssal Harvester, 2 black and 1 for a 3/2 Demon Warlock. You can tap him, exile a creature card from a graveyard that was put there this turn, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a nightmare in addition to its other types. Then, exile all nightmare tokens you control. Now, this actually seems kind of crazy. You get to actually keep the token that you make until you decide to make another token, which I kind of think is insane. Like, say you make an Atali, right? And then you get the triggers off the Atali, which is already pretty crazy. And now your opponent is forced to either kill your giant trampling threat or kill your Harvester. And if they kill the Atali, then you can just exile another creature and do it again, since you no longer have a Nightmare token on the battlefield. You could just get the next thing out and not have to worry about the downside of having to exile all other Nightmare tokens you control. So it's kind of interesting if you use it right. Like, sure, if you're trying to just use it every single turn and keep those creatures, like, you're only going to be able to keep the most recent Nightmare token that you make. But there are definitely ways to utilize this card that get around that. The Atali example was one. In a sacrifice deck, just making a token creature that gets you ETB value, maybe swings in for a combat, and then can later be sacrificed to get some kind of beneficial sacrifice effect before you tap the Harvester to make a new Nightmare to get extra value. Lots of cool ways to use this. I really love this card, and most importantly, it is a 3-mana demon. And demon tribal is kind of a thing in Standard right now. And I'm excited to see if this makes it that much more consistent and potentially viable. Really exciting card. But we're going to move on to Bolt Wave. 1 red for a sorcery. Deals 3 damage to each opponent. This is interesting. Has absolutely no utility whatsoever. It can't hit creatures. It can't, remove problematic permanents at all. But it just nukes your opponent's face for 3. I don't know how viable this is. Maybe in some kind of a prowess deck, although most of those decks really just want to use, buffs that target your own creatures and stuff like that. So I'm not sure, but if you have any ideas about how this could be utilized, maybe in some kind of a storm deck. Is that too much to think of for Standard, a storm deck? Probably. There are a couple cards, but I digress. If you have ideas about Bolt Wave, let me know in the comments. Next up, we have Heraldic Banner, 3 mana for an artifact. When it enters, choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+0, and you can tap it for a mana of the chosen color. This is similar to another card we already have in Standard right now, where you choose a creature type, and those creatures get +1/+1, and then you can tap it for a mana of any color. It's kind of interesting that we have a more baseline version of that sort of card here available in Foundations. It'll be super cool in the right limited archetypes if you're trying to go deep into some of the tribal themes in this set in draft, stuff like Angel Tribal, Dragon Tribal. This should be pretty cool, although it doesn't really care about creature type, right? It cares about color. So, I mean, maybe this is just even more proof that going monocolor is potentially viable and limited. Anyways, it's pretty interesting, but we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Dreadwing Scavenger, 3 mana for a 2/2 Nightmare bird with flying in the colors of Dimir. Whenever this creature enters or attacks, you draw a card and then discard a card. And it has Threshold, so it gets +1/+1 and Death Touch as long as there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard. This is pretty interesting. I actually think this card's going to be really good in Limited. I don't think it's quite there in Constructed. It's just a little too slow for what it's doing for you for the 3 mana, which sounds crazy to say, but power creep, man. It's a hell of a drug. The one really cool upside to this is that it gets the ability to trigger on enter and attack. That means no matter what, you get to trigger the ability once and loot, and help fuel maybe some graveyard synergies, that kind of thing. But also gives you this potential inevitability that if it survives, you get to get extra triggers over the course of the game. So there is some value inherently in that. You will probably eventually get to Threshold if they don't kill this first, and it becomes a 3/3 flying Death Touch, and that's kind of nice. But again, I think this is mainly for Limited, and in Limited, I really do think a card like this will shine. But next up, we've got Dracoth Maw of Flames, a 7/7 legendary dragon with flying for a whopping 7 mana, 3 red and 4. Whenever Dracoth attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target, and 3 damage to each of up to 2 other targets. The last time this was in Standard, it was a backbone of certain Reanimator builds, and it's very, very powerful. The key with making Dracoth work in Standard, at least last time, and I'm going to assume this time as well, is having ways for your reanimation spells to give it haste. And I don't know if we have that, but we do have the next best thing. We do have a 5 mana instant speed reanimation spell. In fact, I think it's a common. Came out in Duskmourn, and I forget the name of it off the top of my head. If you remember, let me know in the comments. But being able to reanimate this at the end of your opponent's turn after they're tapped out, thinking that maybe they can get away with not leaving mana untapped for removal, and now you bring this back from the graveyard at instant speed, immediately untap, swing in, get your triggers, could be an insane amount of value. So I like seeing Dracoth return to Standard. It's going to be pretty powerful in the right decks. The question is it powerful enough to contend with the power level of where Standard is at right now? And I'm not really sure, but yeah, he seems really cool. Next up, we've got Elfsworn Giant, a 5/3 giant with reach for 2 green and 3, and it has a landfall ability. Whenever a land you control enters, create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. This guy's going to be really good in Limited, especially as a common, as something you can pick up 1 or 2 copies later in the draft very easily, without having to give up really good high pick choices earlier in the draft. It's just a cool way of getting out an on-rate creature for the most part that gives you more value over the course of the game as you're dropping extra lands. And one of the problems with Limited is sometimes you get to as many lands as you need, and then literally all the lands you draw after that are kind of dead plays, right? They don't really do anything for you, and you're just trying to draw into more gas than your opponent so that you can stay ahead in time to close out the game. With this landfall ability here, it means that all of your lands you draw later on in the game, they're not going to be dead draws. It's going to be like top decking a 1/1. And that's not like super amazing, but it's not nothing either. It means that you're never going to draw something completely wasteful in the later, in the later turns of a draft game. And I kind of like that about it, and the reach is nice. It helps you deal with flyers. The power is good. If you've cleared the way on the board, it can swing in for a decent amount of damage. So it plays a lot of roles, and I kind of like that. At the end of the day, it's not super amazing, but like I said, it's going to be a late draft pick for sure that will make the cut in a lot of decks. Next up, we've got Ruby Daring Tracker, a 1/2 legendary human scout for 2 mana in the colors of Gruul. She has haste. She can tap for a red mana or a green mana, and whenever she attacks while you control a creature with power 4 or greater, she gets +2/+2 until end of turn. I love seeing Ruby come back. It makes me really wonder if the legendary decks of yore might be able to make a comeback in Standard. She could be a backbone part of that because she can come down on 2 and ramp you into casting your more expensive legendaries. She can even play something the turn that you cast her because of the haste. So slam her on 2, immediately tap her for mana, play a 1 mana removal spell, something like that. Could be pretty relevant. Yeah, I like seeing Ruby here. It gives me hope that there's some kind of a standard archetype that's going to be able to utilize her, but she's going to be great in limited. Like, if you're in Gruul and you get the chance to snatch up Ruby here, she's going to do a lot of work for you, ramping you, helping color fix you for things that require double pips, and being a late game threat herself once you get something else threatening onto the board. So, pretty cool seeing Ruby. But next up we have Wardens of the Cycle. This is a 3/4 elf warlock for 4 mana in the colors of Golgari. Has the Morbid ability, so at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you choose one, gain 2 life, or draw a card and lose a life. Pretty interesting. I actually think this will be really good in limited, especially if you're in some kind of a sacrifice deck, where if you're sacrificing things for payoff anyway, you get to draw an extra card at the end of your turn every turn that you're doing that. And if you're really, really stressed for life, you can also just gain the life. It might be possible to put this alongside some of the life gain payoffs that we've seen in this set as well. We've seen a number of cards already that give you a bunch of value if you gain life. So there might be certain circumstances where you have this out and you have ways to get those value, get those triggers off of gaining life, and maybe you want to choose to gain the 2 life instead, just in order to get all of those triggers. That could be relevant as well, or just padding out your life total to win the race against aggro. There's a lot of versatility with this, but at the end of the day, the potential to draw cards off of an uncommon, repeatedly draw cards off of an uncommon in limited, is going to be pretty strong. So I think this guy will be a serious contender, or girl rather. Pretty sure it's female. But next up we have Affectionate Indrik. This is a 4/4 beast for 1 green and 5, which seems very expensive, but when this creature enters, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. So it's sort of a creature and a removal spell in one. Think of it as an overcosted Flametongue Kavoo that hits for 3 damage, because most of the time that's what you're going to do. You're going to drop it as a 4/4, you're going to kill something with 3 toughness so that you survive, you know, hit a 3/3. Yeah, and then you're good to go. If you're desperate, you could use this to kill a 4/4, but your Indrik's going to die in the process. But still, it has that versatility of potentially removing a smaller threat while also being a 4/4 body, or potentially removing something a little bit bigger if you don't mind losing the Indrik, or also using something to pump it, or something like that. So, cool versatility here. It's a bit more expensive than I'd like for limited. It might see play as a 1-of at the top end, and I don't think it's quite there for constructed because it's just too expensive, but I like this guy. I've liked using him in limited in the past, so he should be pretty fun. Next up we have Lathril, Blade of the Elves. This is a next rare. A 2/3 legendary elf noble with menace for 4 mana in the colors of Golgari. Whenever Lathril deals combat damage to a player, you create that many 1/1 green elf warrior creature tokens. And then you can also tap Lathril and 10 untapped elves you control, and each opponent loses 10 life and you gain 10 life. This guy seems absurd. I would normally think this wasn't quite good enough in standard, given the current card pool, but we're seeing so many good elves come back in Foundation to augment the card pool of elves we already have. So I actually think this might be a thing. The most notable being Llanowar Elves, right? Llanowar Elves coming back, being a 1-drop that lets you cast a 3-drop on turn 2, lets you cast Lathril as early as turn 3, and also is another cheap elf that contributes to this ultimate tap ability that Lathril has, is pretty good. And I think that really starts to turn this idea into something that seems way more viable when you keep that in mind. So Lathril just seems nuts. Swing in a few times, you know, make a bunch of elf tokens, and then eventually use it as a finisher, drain for 10, seems bananas. The one big problem with this card is it's a 4 mana thing that comes down, does nothing the turn it enters, and then probably dies to removal. So that's kind of a tricky part of it that you need to dodge. Anything that costs 4 or 5, you really need to have a way to get some kind of value off it the turn you play it, or to even the odds with something like Ward or whatever if they do use removal to kill it. And this doesn't really have any of that, so I am a bit worried, but the potential of elves is through the roof, so there is definitely a possibility this is good enough. Kind of in a similar way as Sheoldred, right? Sheoldred doesn't really get you any immediate value, but it ended up being so good that it kind of didn't matter. If you do stick it, it just wins you the game. And I don't think this necessarily just wins you the game, but in the right decks, it can get pretty damn close to it, so pretty cool. Next up, we have Secluded Courtyard, a land that enters, when it enters, choose a creature type. It can tap for a colorless mana no matter what, and it can tap for a mana of any color if you use that to cast a creature spell of the chosen type or activate an ability of a creature source of the chosen type. I love seeing Secluded Courtyard coming back into Standard. Before last rotation a couple sets ago, we had both Secluded Courtyard and Cavern of Souls in Standard, and it allowed you to play tribal decks that were like 4 or 5 colors if you were very strict in sticking to the tribal theme. If you only played non-creature spells that were like 1 color, like go monocolor for your go 1 color for your non-creature spells, but then all of your creatures of that type can be like 3, 4, sometimes even 5 colors, because 4 Courtyards, 4 Cavern of Souls, you just have so much fixing. It gets insane. We did that for vampires, we did that for a few different deck types, and I'm excited to dive into that again. We see creature tribal making a huge comeback in this set. A lot of the traditional tribes like angels and dragons, and we already have crazy tribal potential right now from like Bloomburrow and stuff. So the potential to really go deep into tribal and go crazy with the colors while still having all of your lands enter untapped so that you can really keep up with tempo, keep the aggression on. It's exciting. So I actually think this is a really solid and important card coming back to Standard that's going to very easily be overlooked and just seen as a worse Cavern of Souls, whatever, moving on. But man, having 8 cards that can make a mana of any color for your specific creature type is going to be nuts in just the right decks. And I have a bunch of ideas already that I want to try to brew with this playstyle in mind. So I'm excited. Let's do it. But next up we have Hungry Ghoul. 1 black and 1 for a 2/2 zombie. You can pay 1 mana and sack another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Talking about old traditional tribal themes making a comeback, zombies coming back is pretty cool. This isn't going to be really anything more than Draft Shaft, but in the right decks where zombie tribal matters, where you have ways to make zombies that much better, you have those synergies to tap into, this is going to be better. You pick it up towards the end of a draft and you fill out your curve with it, and you know, if you are able to get any of those synergies online, it's going to get that much better for you. That being said, it's not amazing, right? Sacking a creature for a counter and having to pay mana to do it is not the greatest on a 2/2 vanilla 2 mana creature to begin with. So it's definitely filler, but it is filler that has the potential to be way better than it looks in the right decks. Next up we have Reclamation Sage, 1 green and 2 for a 2/1 elf shaman. When this creature enters, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. Love this card. Love the versatility. You get a 2/1 that takes out their most problematic artifact or enchantment. You get the ability to potentially flicker this in later turns to kill more things. Pretty solid staple for sideboards. I don't know if it's good enough to make the cut in today's standard sideboards, but the potential is there. And in Limited, it'll absolutely be a very high pick as a sideboard card. It's not necessarily going to make the main deck, but when you get to the point in the draft when you're really looking to augment your sideboard with some valuable cards, this will probably be a pretty good one to grab. Next up, we've got Diagraph Ghoul, another zombie. This is a 2/2 zombie for just 1 black mana, but it enters tapped. This card really helps make zombie tribal function well if there's enough support for zombie tribal, and specifically if there's enough support for zombie tribal being an aggro deck. Being able to drop this on turn 1 where you don't care if it's tapped, you're not trying to block with it, and then just keep gassing up every turn and swinging in. You're hitting the ground running at a much better pace than a lot of aggro decks with a 2/2 for 1, so It can be really good. Again, if you have ways to supplement it being a zombie and making that matter and making this better than just a 2/2 for 1, that's where it's really going to shine. So it really comes down to how crazy the zombie synergies are and how much support there is there and what sort of ability you have to make this card way better than just what's printed on the text. So we'll see. We'll see. But next up we have Perforating Artist. This is a 3/2 Devil with Death Touch for 3 mana in the colors of Rakdos. And it also has the raid ability. So at the beginning of your end step, if you attack this turn, each opponent loses 3 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent of their choice or discards a card. I love that this kind of raid ability is paired with Death Touch because they don't want to block it. But if they don't block it, it survives, triggers the raid ability, and then they have this problematic trigger that they have to deal with, which is really nice. I think the most excited thing the thing I'm most excited to do with this is probably put it alongside Braids and the Osseous Stick Twister, and just have a deck that goes wide with all of these different creatures that have end of turn triggers that require you to sack or discard or lose a life. And just pile them up on top of each other. I don't know how viable that is, but I'm going to look into seeing if the synergies between Raid and some of the sacrifice synergies for those other cards might be able to cross over enough to really make something like that viable, because I think it could be amazing, just super fun and crazy. But even in just a Rakdos aggro deck, this guy could be super strong. Next up, we've got Eaten Alive. 1 black mana for a sorcery. Exile target creature or planeswalker. Sounds amazing, right? What's the catch? The catch is, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you have to sacrifice a creature or pay 4 mana. Now, there's a couple of things that I really love about Eaten Alive that I need to point out. First of all, it exiles. Being able to potentially exile something for just 1 mana is awesome. Also, in a sacrifice deck, sacrificing a creature is sometimes a good thing. You're looking for ways to sacrifice creatures without dumping extra mana into the sacrifice ability. So, you know, only paying 1 mana to kill the thing and it feeling like you're sacrificing the creature for free to get death triggers and that sort of thing can be really good in the right deck. But the best part about this card is the fact that you just have the option of just paying mana. So in Limited, that's going to really make it shine, because if it's later in the game and you've only got good creatures you really don't want to sacrifice, you just pay the extra mana. Just still exile the thing, just dump that mana that you're not using because maybe you're close to being out of gas, and it doesn't feel that bad. So the versatility makes this card really good. Next up, we have Imprisoned in the Moon. 1 blue and 2 for an enchantment aura. Enchants a creature, land, or planeswalker, and then enchanted permanent is a colorless land that can tap for a colorless mana and loses all other card types and abilities. This kind of reminds me of certain cards that would turn your opponent's creatures into treasure tokens, because you take away their big threat, but you also give them a little bit of mana ramp in the process. Another really cool way of using this is putting it on one of their dual lands, taking away their ability to color fix themselves and get the colors they need to cast things, being only able to now tap that for a colorless mana. And in that way, it makes it so that if they need that colored mana, they're kind of screwed. It also doesn't give them extra mana ramp the way enchanting a creature or planeswalker would, whereas, you know, now they have all of their lands plus this other thing that can tap for a mana. They can cast something bigger a turn quicker. But the versatility is what makes this strong. So is it possible that this could see play in some kind of a land destruction style deck where you're not necessarily destroying the lands, but you're turning them all into colorless mana producers? Maybe. It's a little bit cute, but the potential is there with something like Calyx to swing in, make extra copies of this, start turning all of their lands into things that can only tap to make colorless mana. Seems kind of fun. It's probably way too cute. It's probably way too janky to actually do, but the fact that there's the potential to do something like that is really fun. But mostly this is just pretty good removal for blue, and I like that they're exploring new ways of implementing removal within blue that fits within the themes of blue and doesn't necessarily break the color pie, but also gives you good removal for limited. And this is that. You know, it hits any creature, any planeswalker for 3 mana, and has this silver lining upside of, in the right circumstance, if they only have 1 land that can make a certain color, you can completely shut it off and blow them out and make it so they can't cast all the spells in their hand. And that seems pretty cool. To have that upside on your pretty good on-rate 3 mana creature planeswalker removal card seems wonderful. So I sort of love it. But next up we have Mischief Mystic, 1 blue and 1 for a 2/1 human wizard with flying. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you create a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with flying. This guy's good. 2/1 flyer for 2 is already decently on rate, starts swinging in as early as turn 3 every turn in the air. But every time you draw a second card for the turn, you get a free 1/1 flyer. It's way easy to do on your turn, you just have to draw 1. But also, if you have instant speed ways to draw 2 cards on your opponent's turn, you can get another one. I think in just the right deck, this guy could just fill your board super quick, while also, again, swinging in every turn for 2 damage in the air. And that's kind of what you want your 2-drop to be doing anyway. So, I love this. I think it's going to be amazing in Limited. I think it has a chance in Standard as well, especially if that, like, Flying Matters type deck really comes together. We saw some cards that support that as a theme, and it might be a thing, maybe, possibly, in Standard. Don't hold your breath. But if it is, I think this guy slots in there for sure. Next up, we have Curator of Destinies. This is 2 blue and 4 for a 5/5 Sphinx with flying. It can't be countered, and when the creature enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, set them into a face-down pile, separate them into a face-down pile, and a face-up pile. An opponent chooses one of those piles, put that pile into your hand, and the other into your graveyard. So this is basically a Fact or Fiction on a stick. Well, on a body. You also get a 5/5 flyer, and it can't be countered. So what's cool is you have a 5/5 flyer that can't be countered, but you also have basically a Fact or Fiction that can't be countered as well. You get both of those things, both uncounterable, which is really nice. And I think there's a lot of room to potentially use this in new ways in Standard, now that it's going to be a part of the card pool, because we want stuff in our graveyard. There are so many mechanics in Standard right now that care about the graveyard, whether it's Threshold coming back, or Delirium's already there, or some flashback stuff, some one-off cards. There's a lot of different reasons we want stuff in the graveyard. Roots decks, I'm not saying play this in Roots, but you get my point. Being able to put the other pile into the graveyard can sometimes be a good thing. So, I sort of love this. I'm excited to mess around with it. But next up, we've got Secluded Ink Mage. 1 blue and 2 for a 2/2 Octopus Wizard, and when it enters, you surveil 3. And then it has Threshold, so this creature can't be blocked as long as there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Pretty good. I don't think it's amazing. I think really you want to utilize this if you're in the Threshold deck, or in some kind of a self-mill deck where you really want to fill up the graveyard, because not only does this help to enable that by having you surveil 3 when it enters, but it also gets that Threshold turned on for its own self to become unblockable a lot quicker if you're in that kind of deck anyway, and a lot of the other cards that you're playing are filling up your graveyard. So if you're in the right deck, I think this one will actually be really solid and probably be making the cut in your Limited deck. That being said, you do kind of want to be in that archetype to really get the most out of this. But even just playing a 2/2 for 3 that looks at the top 3 and lets you make sure you get the best card as your next draw is kind of decent. So maybe it's even good enough to play outside of those types of decks in Limited. In Constructed, I don't think this makes the cut, but I've seen crazier things. It's possible that surveilling 3 matters enough, and maybe there's some kind of weird cheeky way to flicker it and keep doing it and really fill up your graveyard super quick. I doubt it. It probably doesn't make the cut in Standard, but there's at least some silver lining potential built in there. Next up, we've got Divine Resilience. 1 white for an instant. Target creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn, but it has a kicker cost of 1 white and 2, and if this spell was kicked, instead any number of target creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. This is kind of amazing. For 1 mana at instant speed, making sure your guy dodges removal seems nuts, especially if you, say, already swing in and your opponent blocks, and then, like, they try to use removal in response or something like that. you really get to blow them out because they had one less blocker to worry about everything else that was swinging in, and sort of wasted it on your guy that's just going to survive. But what really makes this interesting is your 1 mana protection spell doubles as sweeper protection later in the game if you have the mana held up for it. I wonder if this ends up being a staple card in Flash decks. It does look like Flash is coming back in a big way, and if you're flashing out tons of creatures on your opponent's turn and building up a big board, being able to protect them all at instant speed from a Wrath of God style effect that tries to sweep the board seems pretty nuts. Or just cheaply protect one of them at instant speed to targeted removal for just the 1 mana. The versatility makes this awesome. It's probably even really good in Limited, for sure. But we're going to kind of have to see the entire set to know just how good it ends up being. How many things give -X/-X, how many things exile, because Indestructible doesn't protect against that. So the quality of this in Limited is really going to depend on that ratio of how many things you can actually protect your guy from. But let's move on. I digress. This is Aetherize. 1 blue and 3 for an instant. Return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. Very simple. It's kind of one-sided board wipe. Temporary board wipe. But it actually seems really powerful in the right deck. Being able to just hold all your guys back as blockers. Save this. And then on a key turn, just mass bounce their entire team back to their hand and set them back God knows how many turns, having to catch up to their board state again, and it doesn't hit you, right? It lets you keep all your creatures down, start to get a tempo advantage. The more I think about this card, the more I like it. You do have to be clever in how you play it. You know, you have to play around what the opponent's doing, and it's only going to be super useful against aggressive decks. It's obviously not going to be great against control and kind of dead. So it might end up being somewhat of a sideboard card when all is said and done. But I think in Limited, you're going to need creatures to win anyway. So at the very least, in Limited, I think this might be a very solid contender for even a main deck slot, because they're always going to have a bunch of attacking creatures for you to return, right? If you're in some kind of a control build where you're trying to just drag out the game long enough to take control and win through that, you can do a lot worse than to play this pseudo kind of fog effect, but better than fog because it sets them way back on tempo. I kind of love it. But next up we have Swiftfoot Boots coming back into Standard. 2 mana for an artifact equipment. It equips for 1 mana. An equipped creature has hexproof and haste. This card's nuts. This card's nuts. It's not Lightning Greaves, don't get me wrong. You still have to pay mana and all that, but every single creature you play has the ability to get haste for just 1 extra mana, and also be protected because of the hexproof. So if you're not moving this from creature to creature to creature to get value off that haste, you can just keep it on your best thing, and they can never target it with removal. And even if they do find a way to kill it, you just move it on to something else. So I think this is actually going to be really valuable. I will say this. If the equipment deck finally ends up being a thing that actually works in Standard, which a couple cards we've already seen from this set seem to hint at it at least being a possibility, finally. If it is, I think this card will be a pretty huge part of that, just because of the insanity of being able to give anything haste, anything hexproof for as little as just 1 mana. But next up, we've got Taoa Benic Druid, a 3/3 Merfolk Druid, legendary Merfolk Druid, with Landfall for 5 mana in the colors of Simic. Whenever a land you control enters, you gain a life and draw a card. Not a crazy card, right? Definitely not going to see play in Constructed or anything like that. Too slow, too mana intensive. But in Limited, this card is nuts. If you're in Simic in Limited, you slam this, turning every single land into a cantrip after Taoa hits the board is bonkers. The fact that you also get a little bit of supplemental life gain in the process as well to help you come back and maybe win the race against aggro, that sort of thing, it is just insane extra. So in Limited, definitely pick this high if you know you're going into Simic. She's freaking awesome. She's going to put in so much work for you as long as you can survive long enough to get the value off of it. Constructed, not going to make the cut, but love seeing this return to Limited. Next up, we've got Fiendish Panda. This is a 3/2 bear demon for 4 mana in the colors of Orzhov. And whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And when this creature dies, you return another target non-bear creature card with mana value less than or equal to this creature's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. I kind of love this. Even if you never get a life gain trigger on it. It's a 4 mana 3/2 that can trade with something and then get back a 3-drop when it does. And that seems really good. The fact that the 3-drop just comes straight onto the battlefield, not to your hand, actually seems awesome. But then you add to that the fact that whenever you gain life, it gets even bigger, even bigger, even bigger, and it's not limited to once a turn, so you get multiple life gain triggers every turn. Buff this guy up to high hell, make him so big your opponent has to kill him, has to deal with it, or it's going to close out the game for you. And then when they do, you get your best creature from the graveyard back, which seems awesome. I also love that it's a demon. I don't think it's quite good enough to make the cut in like constructed demon tribal or anything like that with Unholy Annex, that kind of deck. But I do think this has potential in constructed. I'm on the fence. Part of me thinks it's a little bit cost prohibitive and it's just a little bit too much mana. But there's another part of me that thinks the value you can get off all those life gain triggers is definitely there. Life gain is a thing in standard right now for sure. And the fact that you kind of get built-in card advantage by getting your best thing back when it dies really makes me second guess whether this might actually be viable in standard. I do think it's possible, but in limited, if you're in the life gain archetype, this is going to be nuts. This is going to be a very high pick if all of the stuff that you're playing is going deep into gaining life. And even if you're not in the life gain deck, this is still a decent pick in a normal Orzhov style deck because it's got that card advantage. It comes down, it trades okay, and then gets back like your best 3-drop even without gaining any life. So I really like it. I'm excited to mess around with it. But next up we have Banner of Kinship. This is 5 mana for an artifact. As it enters, you choose a creature type. This artifact enters with a fellowship counter on it for each creature you control of the chosen type. And then creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1 for each fellowship counter on this artifact. I sort of love this. This is a fixed coat of arms. I say fixed. I don't know if coat of arms needed to be fixed. This is a slightly less power coat of arms, but still really, really good. The main thing here is you need to have creatures of the type that you're running on the battlefield before you play it in order to get those counters. But the upside here, the one thing that makes this better than Coat of Arms gives all of your creatures +1/+1 for each creature that shares a type with it. Now, if you have a whole bunch of creatures out that share a type and you jam a Banner of Kinship, if they wipe the board, you still have all of those counters. Right? You still have all of those fellowship counters on the Banner of Kinship. So you play just one creature of that type, it's still going to get buffed to high hell. Whereas with Coat of Arms, if they wipe your whole board and then you play just one, it's only going to get a little tiny marginal buff. The buff that it can give resets. So there's risk and reward here. With Coat of Arms, you don't lose all of your potential buffing if they, wipe your board before you get a chance to play it. But with Banner of Kinship, if you can just make sure you get it out there while you have your creatures out there, at that point it almost doesn't matter if they sweep, because every creature that you play is going to come down, get the full buff from before they swept, and then be a huge relevant threat that your opponent has to deal with. And they're probably, if you're going wide with a creature type, they're probably not going to be able to afford to have spot removal for every single creature one at a time that comes down and gets this huge buff off the banner. It really puts you into a crazy good position even if they wipe the board. The trick is you need to get it out while you have the creatures. And if there's some way to make that more consistent, easier to do, 5 mana is kind of a lot, but that could be really a thing that impacts standard. It's exciting to see it at least be there and the potential be there. We're gonna try it. I don't know which tribe might be best with a card like this, but if you have ideas about how you'd want to use it, let me know in the comments, because the potential is through the roof. Next up we have Wildwood Scourge. This is 1 green and X for a 0/0 Hydra. It enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, so for 2 mana it's a 1/1, for 3 mana it's a 2/2, so on and so forth. And whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on another non-Hydra creature you control, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. I used to run +1/+1 counter tribal in Standard a number of years ago. There were some really cool build-around cards that made it super viable at the time. It was super fun, and this was actually a core part of that deck, so I like seeing it come back. If +1/+1 counter tribal ends up being a thing that's viable, this card could be an important part of that. The fact that it just keeps getting buffed up as you get counters on other things makes it really powerful if you are super deep into counters. In Limited, I think it's also going to be super fun. Really hoping there's enough support for +1/+1 counters to make this a consistent thing that you want to be playing in that sort of archetype in Limited. So, just excited to see it come back. But next up we have Celestial Armor. 1 white and 2 for an artifact equipment with flash. When it enters, you attach it to target creature you control, and that creature gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Also, the equipped creature gets +2/+0 in flying, and then it equips for 1 white and 3. So the one downside here is that it's pretty expensive to re-equip, right? 4 mana, and all you get out of it is +2 power and flying. But you kind of want to look at that as gravy, as extra. This is mainly a 3 mana thing that protects your guy against targeted removal. Because it has flash, you flash it in response to them trying to kill something. And whether it's hexproof you need or indestructible you need, indestructible means it survives like a Wrath of God. Hexproof means it can survive like a -X/-X targeted spell. So you have versatility there. And that's where it's going to be best. You come in, you protect your dude, and you get some buff and flying in the process. And then the equip cost, that's just gravy. If they do end up dealing with your dude down the line, at least you have leftover value, and you can get some of that value by equipping it onto another creature. So I don't hate it. I do worry it's a little bit much to protect your dude, and it's a little bit much to re-equip, and maybe it ends up being just a little bit too slow. But this is another good example of a card where, again, if the equipment deck ends up being a thing, this could be a huge part of that. Being able to have your protection spell count as an equipment so that it also works with your equipment synergies could be huge. It could be a way to fit, you know, a protection spell into a deck like that without, you know, lowering the amount of equipment that you have to get value off of your equipment synergies. So in that deck, this has potential, I think. In Limited, it's going to be insane, but I mean, it's a rare, so of course it is. Next up, we have Spinner of Souls. 1 red and 2 for a 1 green and 2. I need coffee. I'm not going to take a coffee break, though. I want to get through this. So you're stuck with my Nectar of the Gods ASMR. Hashtag deal with it. Okay. Spinner of Souls. 1 green and 2 for a 4/3 Spider Spirit with reach. And whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature. Put that card into your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. The thing I like most about this is that it's a pretty good on-rate creature for the mana regardless of the ability. Because I think if it wasn't, it would be a little bit problematic, right? But a 4/3 reach for 3 mana is plenty defendable as an on-rate creature, right? It has power higher than its mana value, which is key. And then the fact that if they don't kill this first and kill your other stuff, you're getting value. Every time they kill one of your creatures, you're replacing it with another creature from the top of your deck. Granted, it goes to your hand. You have to take the time to cast those things. But it still allows you to keep all of your card advantage and not really get put behind. Now, what's cool about this is it doesn't say whenever another, like 1 or more non-token creatures or something like that. So, say you have a Spinner of Souls and 4 other creatures out. If they cast a sweeper and kill the whole board, you get 4 triggers from your 4 other creatures. All of them give you the ability to hit a creature and put it into your hand. So it really is insane sweeper protection that refills your hand with just as many creatures as you lost, minus the Spinner of Souls. But the Spinner itself is open to removal. That being said, it's a 3-drop that's kind of aggressive, so it doesn't hurt as bad if it hits removal. Like, that's just kind of what happens to aggressive 3-drops. So, all in all, I think this card is great. I don't know if it's good enough to see play. I think when Sunfall's gone, it will. But until then, your guess is as good as mine. Next up, we have Youthful Valkyrie. I am so excited about this card. You don't understand. Maybe you think I'm overly excited, but this is a 1/3 flying angel for 1 white and 1. Whenever another angel you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. This card is so key for Angel Tribal. This was the card we needed to make it all work, believe it or not. We saw 𝑭𝒐𝒑 spoiled in yesterday's video, which, if you haven't seen that already, I'm linking all of the other spoiler videos in the description and in the comments, so check those out, because we go over all of the other cards that have been released so far. But we mentioned when we were talking about 𝑭𝒐𝒑 how the one thing that Angel Tribal really needs to be consistent is another really good 2-drop angel to go along with 𝑭𝒐𝒑, because having just 𝑭𝒐𝒑 is not quite enough to have that consistency of a turn 2 play. And you don't really want to lean on just using 2-mana removal spells as what you think is going to be your 2-mana play. You really want stuff that you're going to curve out with if you end up against control decks and stuff like that. If you didn't draw your 𝑭𝒐𝒑 and all you have is a removal spell and you're up against control, you're losing serious tempo advantage just kind of like not playing anything. So we really needed another 2-drop angel that was good enough to make the cut regardless of any of the other stuff to go alongside 𝑭𝒐𝒑. That gives us 8 now. 4 𝑭𝒐𝒑s, 4 Youthful Valkyries, 8 2-drop angels that are super good that we want to play on turn 2 and that are just going to get us crazy value. And that's what we need. We're there. We're at the threshold, and now an entire world of Angel Tribal potential is unlocked. I love that. This card is nuts. I am so excited. Even if you just play 1 angel on turn 3, it's a 2/4 flyer that costs you 2 mana. That's nuts. That is so good. I can't wait to brew Angel Tribal. It's going to be bonkers. But next up, we have Inspiring Call. This is 1 green and 2 for an instant. Draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it, and those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. So another really good card for that +1/+1 counter theme, and another reason why I am that much more closer to thinking that's going to be viable. Definitely in limited, possibly in constructed, but having a protection spell to protect all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters while also drawing you a full grip of cards seems insane. Just go wide with creatures, put counters on all of them, your opponent tries to Wrath, you respond with Inspiring Call. No, I'll keep everything, and I'll draw a card for all of them. That seems crazy. It is a little bit expensive, but when you take into account the fact that you get both effects at the same time, it is pretty nutty, and it's instant speed, and it's wonderful, and I love it, and we're going to play it, and we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Abrade. Abrade's coming back. I'll say about this what I've said about a lot of the less interesting reprints that we've got. Seeing Abrade come back in the Foundation set means we don't have to worry about that card slot being wasted on future standard sets down the line, where they're like, oh no, Abrade's about to rotate out of standard, but we really want to keep it in standard. Let's force it into the next standard set so we can keep it around. We don't have that problem, right? It's going to be in Foundations. It's going to be a part of standard for basically ever. And that's cool. That frees up way more design space for more interesting stuff in every standard set coming down the line. Instant for 1 red and 1, does 3 damage to a creature or destroys an artifact. Some versatile removal for limited for sure. But next up we have Swiftblade Vindicator. 2 mana in the colors of Boros for a 1/1 human soldier with double strike, vigilance, and trample. Love this guy. Human tribal. Can we do it? You bet your ass we can, and we're gonna try it. We're gonna try it maybe on day 1. It seems like it could be nuts, but even in just like a Boros aggro deck, this seems really good, especially because prowess decks are really popular right now and have a ton of support. Playing this in a prowess deck where you're using a whole bunch of buffs that buff up your creatures anyway, allows you to get so much more value out of that double strike and to a lesser extent the trample, and seems kind of insane. So maybe this makes the cut there. It's definitely going to make the cut in something. This card is bonkers. Crazy that it's coming back to standard. But next up we have Heroic Reinforcements. A sorcery for 4 mana in the colors of Boros. You create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens, and until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 and haste. So pretty cool. You can play it on like turn 5 alongside a good 1-drop. Give the 1-drop haste as well as the tokens that you made. You can also play it in decks that have permanents that are pumping out tokens every turn, so that the turn that you play it, you have the potential to give a bunch of things haste to swing in that otherwise wouldn't be able to, even though you don't necessarily have extra mana to play other creatures to give haste to. So finding ways of generating value in that way could be pretty interesting for this card. But overall, solid. Gives you board presence. Gives you a pseudo alpha strike kind of ability as well. Should be fun to build into the aggro decks in Limited for sure. Next up we have Goblin Negotiation. 2 red and X for a sorcery. It deals X damage to a creature, and create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to the amount of excess damage dealt to that creature this way. Seems awesome. In the Goblin deck, you can even target your own 1/1 Goblin and pay like X is 3 to just make 3 new ones. And maybe you can get triggers off of new creatures entering the battlefield, so it's even worth it to lose one and get one in that way. That being said, most of the time this is just going to be removal and board presence in the same card, and you're just going to dump all your mana into it. Kind of amazing in Limited. It might be too slow for Constructed. I don't feel like there's a world where you're playing a Goblin deck that doesn't mind waiting until you have a bunch of mana to tap to dump into the X cost. But also just if you play it early, it's just really bad on rate removal if you're not getting any goblins out of it, right? It's below rate removal for the mana that you pay. So it feels pretty bad for Constructed, but I think for Limited this is going to be really strong, where you can afford for the games to drag out a bit longer, top deck this later in the game, get an insane amount of value off of it. Seems really good, so I like it there. But next up we have Quilled Great Worm. This is 2 green and 4 for a 7/7 worm with trample, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage during your turn, you put that many +1/+1 counters on it. That's every creature that deals damage gets counters equal to how much damage it dealt. And it doesn't even need to be to a player. That's the huge thing that most people will probably overlook, and you shouldn't. It doesn't have to deal combat damage to an opponent, just combat damage at all. So your first strikers will deal their damage, get a bunch of +1/+1 counters, and then potentially survive against the creature that blocked them if that creature was bigger than the base creature, which is really, really interesting. Even better with double strike, right? If you swing in with a 3/3 double striker and they block with like a 4/4, you're going to hit first, get 3 counters, become a 6/6, and then hit again, kill it, and now be big enough that their 4/4 doesn't kill it back, which is nuts. But we have another ability here as well. You may cast this card from your graveyard by removing 6 counters from among creatures you control, in addition to paying its other costs. That seems crazy. You do have to still pay the mana, right? You're not being able to cheat things out. But it does give you the ability to just play anything back from your graveyard as long as you're going wide enough with counters. And that seems just absolutely bananas. Just both of those abilities on the same creature is what makes it so good. It is expensive. Who knows, might not make the cut in Constructed in Standard because it is so expensive. By the time you start using it, it's kind of win more, that sort of thing. But I don't think so. I think there's a world in which the +1/+1 counters deck is a real thing, and maybe this just gets discarded or self-milled into the graveyard, and you just play it straight from your graveyard without ever really having it in your hand. There could be potential there. There's honestly a lot of ways this could be used. I'm excited to brew. I am still worried it's a bit too expensive. It could very well be way too expensive for Standard, but I'm hopeful that there's some crazy way we can use this. So if you have ideas, let me know in the comments. I think the potential's there on this one. But next up, we've got Dragon Trainer. This is 2 red and 3 for a 1/1 human, and when this creature enters, you create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. I sort of love this, and it's way, way better than getting a 4/4 flying dragon for 5 that makes a 1/1 token when it enters. Because if you find ways to flicker this or blink it, every single time you get a 4/4 flyer, which is nuts. So getting 5 power, 5 toughness spread across 2 bodies, the bigger one having flying, is pretty good and pretty on rate for 5 mana here. But Dragon Tribal could be a thing moving forward. Like I said, Flicker and Blink decks could be a thing. There's untapped potential with a card like this for sure. It's a bit expensive, but in Limited, you definitely play it. It's just a 4/4 flyer for 5 is pretty good in Limited as it is. Getting all of this potential Silver Lining upside alongside it is even better. But next up, we've got Rune Sealed Wall. 1 blue and 2 for a 0/6 wall with Defender, and you can tap it to Surveil 1. Nothing crazy here. Not going to make the cut in Standard. If you are in some kind of a crazy control deck in Limited, this might be really good to just hold down the fort until you can drag the game out to a point where you can cast your high value spells, gain control of the board, and that sort of thing. Being able to Surveil 1 at the end of your opponent's turn, every turn in the process, kind of for free, is pretty nice too. Lets you scry into what you need while also potentially dumping stuff in your graveyard that you want in the graveyard. So in just the right deck, this might make the cut. It could be pretty cool. But next up, we've got Preposterous Proportions. 2 green and 5 for a sorcery. All creatures you control get +10/+10 and Vigilance until end of turn. Oh god. Talk about your late game Alpha Strike. Now you do need to ramp to having enough mana. And then you want to go as wide as possible to get as much value off this as possible. So ramping while going wide. What does that? Elf Tribal, right? Probably. This seems like it could be almost like a poor man's replacement for like a Craterhoof Behemoth in some sort of standard version of Elves, where you're going wide with Elves, some of them are tapping for mana, letting you cast this a little bit earlier, and whoever you're not tapping for mana, they're all swinging in as these giant Vigilance creatures. Could be pretty nuts. We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Meteor Golem. That's right, Meteor Golem is returning. A 3/3 artifact creature golem for 7 mana. That is a lot. But when this creature enters, you destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls. Another really good cards for Flicker decks, especially if it's a Flicker deck where you have a way of getting this out super cheap or super efficiently, maybe cheating it out in some way. It gets even better. My thought is maybe we play it in some kind of a Manifest Dread Cloak deck, because if we hit this off of a Manifest Dread, put it into play as a face-down creature, then we can use Flicker spells to flicker the card. It'll come back in as the front side of the card and kill something, which seems nuts, while also being there to cast more Flicker spells on later in the game to get more non-land permanent destruction triggers. That seems like maybe it's a thing we could do, but it's also nice for Limited that it's colorless. It's just this colorless way of having a late game play, which gets rid of the worst thing on the opponent's side and gives you a little bit of a body in the process, and that's not nothing in Limited, so I think it'll be kind of cool there as well. Next up, we have Kiora, the Rising Tide, another rare, the next rare, a 3/2 legendary Merfolk Noble for 1 blue and 2, and when she enters, you draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards, so she is going to help you fill up your graveyard, help you dig for the cards that you need, but also has this threshold ability. So whenever she attacks, if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you may create Scion of the Deep, a legendary 8/8 blue octopus creature token. This seems crazy. Now the token is legendary, so we can't use any crazy, ridiculous shenanigans like 3 blind mice to get extra value off the token. But it is still really good, right? The fact that that triggers off of every attack as well means maybe you potentially always have sacrifice fodder. Since it's legendary, you can sacrifice the one that swung maybe and then make the new one. Or maybe you just don't mind losing it to removal because every turn you have the potential to swing in and make a new one. And that can get really problematic for the opponent. Yeah, this card's great. I don't know if it's quite there in Constructed. It might be just too slow for what it does in Standard. In Limited, this is a slam dunk. But again, it's a rare, so it's not going to come up too often in Limited. But still an interesting card. I'm curious if there's a way to really kind of bend or maybe even break it, though. So if you have ideas, let me know in the comments. I love the flavor, though. But next up, we have Twin Blade Blessing. 2 white and 1 for an enchantment aura with flash. Enchants a creature. Enchanted creature has double strike. I really kind of love this. It looks a little bit overcosted, but getting double strike at flash speed is bananas. Absolutely bananas when you consider the fact that you get to keep that double strike forever. Like, you flash this in when your opponent attacks, you block with your dude, kill his dude, survive yourself because of the first strike probably, and then immediately get to crack back the next turn with a big double striker. That seems awesome. I want to use it in the aura enchantment decks with stuff like, not Imperial Armor. What's the name of that card? What's the 1-drop from Duskmourn that gives your guy +X/+X, where X is the number of enchantments and also gives it first strike? But using it alongside that card and some of the other cheap auras that buff up creatures and stuff, this could be a real insane play that wins you the game almost on the spot, depending on the circumstances. That being said, it is 3 mana, so I don't know. Those decks might be too fast to really get value off of this. So I don't know. We're going to have to test it. In Limited, it's going to be nuts. Being able to give your creature double strike forever is nuts. The one downside to that is they can just use removal and 2-for-1 you, but the flash helps mitigate that a little bit, right? If they can flash it in at a key point in time where it means you kill their creature that you otherwise wouldn't, and are left with the creature, you at least get 2-for-1, right? Or you at least flash it in knowing that they're tapped out, they can't kill it, and you get to at least attack once. So there are some ways baked into the card that it kind of mitigates the problems of it just being an aura that goes away when they kill your thing and you get 2-for-1. And I like that about it as well. But next up, we've got Tolarian Terror. That's right, it's being reprinted. A 5/5 Serpent for 1 blue and 6. It also has Ward 2, but the catch here is it costs 1 less to cast for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. This used to be the other creature that goes alongside Haughty Djinn in those kinds of decks. That is sort of your win condition in those sort of put a lot of instants and sorceries in your graveyard style decks. But recently, with Oculus getting released in Duskmourn, it kind of took that slot and morphed that deck into an Azorius thing that's kind of different now. So I don't know Tolarian Terror is necessary, but it is cool to see a card like this in Foundations as sort of like a benchmark. Like, no matter what, at some point down the line, if you lose enough good creatures for a deck like that, you can just slot in the Terror and the deck can still exist. So I think that's pretty cool. But next up, we've got Krenko Mob Boss. I can't believe this is going to be in Standard. This is a 3/3 Legendary Goblin Warrior for 2 red and 2. And you can tap him, create X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, where X is the number of goblins you control. If there was any doubt whatsoever about Goblin Tribal coming back to Standard in a big way, this card should absolutely smash all of those doubts. That being said, we do really need a consistent way to give Krenko haste to make it really, really good and to make that deck super good. But at the very least, the potential is here. Krenko Mob Boss will be in Standard. It will do all the crazy things, and it will be really fun to see if doing all of those crazy things is good enough for today's Standard. I'm excited to find out. But we're going to move on to Spectral Sailor. 1 blue for a 1/1 Spirit Pirate with flash and flying. You can also pay 4 mana to draw a card at instant speed. This is sort of a staple of all of the flash decks of old. It comes down super cheap, so if you just have something you need to do on their turn and interact with what they're doing and happen to have a mana left over, you can just jam it out for that 1 mana. Ends up being a super efficient play. But then it also gives you this inevitability where later in the game, if you run out of gas, you have a mana sink and you can just draw cards. And I sort of love that. Yeah, this is just, man, this coming back into Standard brings back so many memories. There was a point in time where this was a huge player. I could see this in flash decks. I could also see this in like mono blue style decks where you just get out this creature super early, put some kind of big buff enchantment on it, and then just protect it forever and ever, and eventually ride it to victory. This was used in that way a lot back in the day, and I have an inkling that there might be a deck like that that's going to exist in the new standard when this set drops. So cool to see Spectral Sailor here. But next up we have Soulstone Sanctuary. This is a land, taps for a colorless mana, or you can pay 4 mana and it becomes a 3/3 creature with vigilance and all creature types. But it's still a land. This reminds me a lot of the card we got in Kaldheim that used snow mana. What was that card called? Something Nexus, I think. If you remember the name of that card, let me know in the comments. But there was a card similar to this in Kaldheim that used snow-covered mana to turn the land into a creature that counts as all creature types. This is a little bit better, I think, because it doesn't require the snow-covered land. And the fact that it's all creature types is actually super awesome. And the vigilance also means that, like, after combat, you could potentially tap it for mana because it's still untapped. And I kind of love that about it too. I think with tribal decks being very prominent right now, and there being a lot of tribal support in Bloomburrow, and pretty much coming in this set as well, I think there's a lot of potential for something like this to be nuts as a way to, like, later in the game, just all of a sudden you have a 3/3 that picks up all of these crazy tribal advantages off of, you know, your tribal lords and stuff like that. That could get super, super crazy. I like this card a lot. I'm glad it exists. My eyes roll a little bit when I think about control decks just using this as their win condition and just not putting creatures in their deck. It gets a little scary, but it's a great creature. I like it. Next up we have Essence Scatter. Essence Scatter is coming back. This is 1 blue and 1 for an instant. Counters a creature spell. I don't think this really makes the cut in standard. There's a really problematic super deep creature deck, like maybe it gets sideboarded at some point. But for the most part, this is meant to be sort of like a staple counterspell type effect within Limited. I don't normally tend to gravitate towards playing stuff like that in Limited, but it's there for those that need it, and that's the function that this card will serve. But next up we've got Bite Down. 1 green and 1 for an instant. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. Just a simple bite spell. It's called Bite Down, right? It's not a fight. Your guy's not in danger at all. No matter what, your guy survives. But if your guy is big enough, you can kill their creature or potentially their planeswalker. What's cool about targeting a planeswalker too is you don't necessarily have to kill it, right? If you've only got a 3/3 to use this on and they have a 4 loyalty walker, you still reduce their loyalty down to 1, and that's not nothing. So it's cool stuff you can do here. Like seeing Bite Down come back. Next up we have Icewind Elemental, a 3/4 elemental with flying for 1 blue and 4. And when this creature enters, you draw a card and then discard a card. Seems awesome. It's not super good, but for a common, I think it's awesome. As a way to sort of flesh out your curve, make sure you have one of those high-end sort of game-winning threats for Limited. Not that this is the best win con you could jump in your deck, but if you did a really good job drafting into control, getting a bunch of really good picks early on that control the board, but you find yourself short on win conditions, you could do a lot worse than to jam this in your deck, use it as your win condition at your top end, get a little bit of extra value when it enters. Seems like pretty okay filler. But next up we've got Strongbox Raider, a 5/2 orc pirate for 2 red and 2. Has the raid ability, so whenever it enters, if you attack this turn, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. This seems like pretty good card advantage in very aggressive Limited decks. You just vomit out everything you have, probably play this when you're almost out of gas, and then get a little bit of value, and you get to play it until the end of your next turn, not this turn. And that's the key line of text that sets the really good exile play type cards apart from the ones that are not as good. Getting to untap and use all of your mana to potentially play what you exiled is key. I think this will be really fun and Limited, especially with it having 5 power for 4 mana. I think this kind of does a lot for specific aggressive Limited decks, so should be pretty good. But next up we have Drakehatcher, 1 blue and 1 for a 1/3 human wizard with vigilance and prowess. That's already kind of a lot. But whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you put that many incubation counters on it, and then you can at any time remove 3 incubation counters from the creature, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. That seems kind of nuts. If you get through for a whole bunch of damage all at once because you buffed it up with the prowess triggers, you get a whole bunch of incubation counters. You could theoretically remove them all. If you buffed this up to a 6/3 and hit for 6, you could immediately remove all 6 counters and make 2/2/2 flyers for no mana, which seems crazy. And it has vigilance, so this still sticks around as a blocker. And even if you're not doing those crazy late game plays, like for 2 mana, this still comes down and puts in a lot of work for you early in the game, especially in those aggro prowess style decks. So this might be a real contender for Constructed, honestly. This might show up in Standard and be a real nuisance. It's a very, very interesting card for sure. But next up we got Dwynen Gilt-Leaf Dane. This is a 3/4 legendary elf warrior with reach for 2 green and 2. Other elf creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever Dwynen attacks, you gain 1 life for each attacking elf you control. So kind of an uncommon elf lord. I like seeing the uncommon elf lord not only show up at the uncommon slot, since so that elf tribal can be a more consistent archetype within limited, but also be kind of balanced, not be super crazy, not be anywhere near as insane as some of the older elf tribal style lord kind of cards that we used to get. So I think this is a perfect sweet spot. I love being able to jam a decently on-rate body that buffs up all of your elves and then gets you this supplemental value with these life gain triggers whenever you attack with them. So I like it. The one downside is you do have to attack with Dwynen herself, which is kind of a bummer in order to get the triggers. But the triggers do count every single attacking elf that you have, which is nice. But next up we have Fleeting Distraction. 1 blue for an instant. Target creature gets -1/-0 until end of turn. Draw a card. Again, another good one that I like seeing come in at the common level as a sort of set the bar within the foundation set, so that new players kind of have this idea of what a card like this looks like and the precedent for it and where the floor is of cards with abilities like this. Getting to draw a card for 1 mana at instant speed is very valuable and not something that should be taken lightly. So having a card that does that, but also gives -1/-0 for a little extra, value tacked on, and that being the baseline, not making something like Opt the baseline at common, I think is really important signaling for, where Magic ends up going from here. Pretty cool. But next up we've got Joust Through. 1 white mana for an instant. It deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and you gain 1 life. Seems good, actually, for 1 white mana. They could have just made it do 3 damage to an attacking or blocking creature and called it a day. It still would have been decent. But the fact that you gain a little bit of life here means that in life gain decks where you have triggers that you get for gaining life, this card ends up being nuts. Not only do you remove a 3 toughness creature for just 1 mana at instant speed, but you also trigger all of your life gain triggers. It doesn't even matter that you're only gaining 1 life. What matters is that you're gaining some amount of life. Put counters on your Pride Mates and some other variations of that card that are in Standard. Even a 4 mana one that we've seen in this set already, which if you haven't seen that card, I spoiled it, I think, in the last spoiler we went over. Check out the older spoiler videos. Again, those are linked in the description and in the comments, so check those out because there's a lot more crazy cards if you haven't seen everything yet. And life gain as an archetype is actually looking pretty legit. I think this might even make the cut in a standard life gain deck as sort of like that deck's version of a cut down in a way. I would not be surprised at all. Super solid removal for limited as well, obviously. But next up we've got Genesis Wave. 3 green and X for a sorcery. Reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of permanent cards with mana value X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Then put all cards revealed this way that weren't put onto the battlefield into your graveyard. What I like most about this card is it helps you to fill up your graveyard. Even if you don't hit everything, like, you can still fill up your graveyard, and you get to choose. Just because you hit things that fit the criteria of being able to be put straight onto the battlefield doesn't mean you have to. If there's a card you really, really just want in the graveyard, it turns on some of your synergies or whatever, you can opt not to put that onto the battlefield and still put it into your graveyard, which adds a little bit of versatility to something like this. But it is pretty mana intensive. You need to really ramp to get the most value out of it. And I'm super curious if something like this is worth playing in like the Doppelgang style decks, or maybe in some kind of deck that's similar to the Doppelgang decks, but uses this instead of Doppelgang. I'm not 100% sure. If you think you have ideas about where this slots in, how best to use it, definitely let me know in the comments. Tons of potential, but we do have Doppelgang, so I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But next up, we have Brineborn Cutthroat, a 2/1 Merfolk Pirate with Flash for 1 blue and 1. And whenever you cast a spell during an opponent's turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Even more Flash tribal support, which seems super insane to me. Being able to jam this out on your opponent's turn after they tapped out all their mana, don't have a way to remove it, seems nuts. And then every time you cast a spell on your opponent's turn, which in a Flash deck is going to be every spell you cast, basically, you get to put a counter on it. Just get it out early, stop everything your opponent does, build this into a huge threat, and use it to win the game. Seems awesome. Man, Flash is definitely going to be a thing again. It's already a thing. I'm running a really interesting high noon Flash deck right now on the ranked ladder, and it's been doing super well for me. In fact, as of the time of publishing this video, the deck tech for that deck is the most recent deck tech on the channel. So check that out, because Flash is a real thing already, and it's getting so much support in this set. Really excited to see Brineborn Cutthroat here. But next up, we've got Ghalta Primal Hunger, a 12/12 legendary elder dinosaur for a whopping 12 mana, 2 green and 10. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control, and it has trample. So the idea is in Green Stompy, you go super wide with high-powered creatures as quick as possible, and then you jam this as a 12/12 trample for 2 mana when, you know, after you've played everything else out. And we've seen decks do stuff like that in the past. It'll be interesting to see if a deck like that is actually a contender in the new standard once Foundation launches. But the potential for the power level of this card is bananas. So excited to see if it actually makes an impact. But next up, we have Mild-Mannered Librarian. It's Janine, guys. It's Janine. Oh, quite parched. I've been talking for almost an hour and a half, so let's get through these last handful of cards. 1 green for a 1/1 human, has the ability to pay 1 green and 3 to give this creature, this creature becomes a werewolf, and you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it and draw a card, but activate only once, ever. I actually kind of love that. In Limited, this seems great. It's just a 1 mana creature, comes down early, gives you some potential for growth later on. Later on, it draws you a card and becomes a 3/3 so that it's a more relevant threat. It's not like insanely good, it's nothing to write home about, but in the right decks, this is going to be strong. I think this will be particularly strong in the +1/+1 counters matters decks, because it gives you just an early body to have another thing you can put your counters on, turn it into a much more relevant threat regardless of its ability. But then later on, you can still get an extra 2 counters and draw a card when you have mana to dump into the mana sink, which makes it kind of good. So I think in that deck in particular, this card could be a real contender. But next up, we've got Brass's Bounty. 1 red and 6 for a sorcery. For each land you control, you create a treasure token. Full stop. There's a combo deck that wants this, right? Maybe the Doppelgang decks? You just double your mana potential, say go, try to hold on to your treasures until you untap, and then play something absolutely insanely ridiculous. You could also get value off of playing this in some kind of a deck where when your artifacts die, you get some kind of trigger or extra value, because all of those treasure tokens, that means you could sack them all for mana that same turn, and even though you didn't get to ramp into more costly things. You're just basically spending the mana you got from the Brass's Bounty the same turn to make up for the lands that you tap to play it. But getting all of that sacrifice value off potentially sacrificing the treasure tokens off of something like, it's not standard legal anymore, but something like Oni Cult Anvil. Similar style effects that give you value off of things being sacrificed. It could be used in that way too. But it takes a whopping 7 mana to cast this spell, so I don't know if those kinds of synergies are really where it's best used. It'll be interesting to see if this even is a thing in Standard. It'll definitely have to be a very specific combo-oriented style deck. But next up, we've got Sylvan Scavenging. This is an enchantment for 2 green and 1. At the beginning of your end step, you get to choose one. You put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, or create a 3/3 green raccoon creature token if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. This card's kind of nuts. It's sort of like a Luminarch Aspirant that costs 1 extra mana and doesn't come with a body, which has upsides and downsides. You don't have more pressure to put on the opponent that you get from having a body, but you also don't have this be vulnerable to the same kind of removal that a creature would be, which is nice. And as long as you can just get a creature buffed up to 4 or more, you can start spitting out 3/3s every single turn. A 3 mana enchantment that spits out a 3/3 every turn is really good. That's really good. You have to jump through hoops to turn it on, and the other ability that it has helps you jump through those hoops a little bit easier, which is nice. But at the end of the day, if you can consistently drop those 3/3 raccoons every turn, that's just a machine, man. And this could be put to crazy good use in that way. You can also make copies of it with something like 𝑐𝐏𝐻𝑒𝐿 and start really doubling up, tripling up on the insane triggers. So, lots of potential with a card like this. Man, so much to brew, so much to try. But moving on, we've got 1,000 Years Storm. This is an enchantment that's 6 mana in the colors of Izzet. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it for each other instant and sorcery spell you've cast before it this turn. You may choose new targets for the copies. So it basically, unofficially, gives all of your instants and sorceries Storm. So that comment I made a little bit earlier in the video about that certain card potentially being viable if a Storm deck is viable, this is one of the cards that might make that a possibility. Even if it isn't, just the idea of a Storm deck existing in Standard potentially by using this card is scary to think about. It could end up being insane, but I don't know. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments. I think the potential for this to really come out swinging is pretty huge, but there's also potential for it to just be a complete dud and too expensive and not quite make the cut. So let me know how you feel in the comments. But next up, we have Flamewake Phoenix. After I drink my coffee, oh god, my allergies are getting me so bad. I think it's also partly because I'm getting pretty dehydrated, running out of liquids to drink, and I'm feeling very parched because I haven't shut up for an hour and 23 minutes. But that's okay. This is a 2/2 Flamewake Phoenix for 2 red and 1. It has flying and haste, and it attacks each combat if able. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you can pay 1 red mana, and if you do, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Pretty awesome. As long as you can keep your damage output high, your potential damage output, by keeping power 4 or greater creatures on the field, you just keep bringing this back over and over and over. That being said, your opponent probably kills the stuff that's allowing you to bring this back, right? So it is a little difficult to pull off. I don't know how consistent it's going to be, but it's only 1 red mana to just keep a 2/2 swinging at the face with haste in the air every turn. Seems like there's potential there. It just really needs the right kind of support to make it so that you consistently can keep getting it back over and over and over again. I don't know. Will that exist in Standard? We'll find out. Next up, we have Exsanguinate. 2 black and X for a sorcery. Each opponent loses X life. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. That's awesome. That's really good. The line, the wording is very specific. Instead of saying each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, you gain life equal to the life lost this way actually matters, because if you have an ability that says, like, when an opponent loses life, they lose that amount of life +1 or something like that, it means that the life you gain will also scale alongside it. So in that example, if you did this with x equaling 3, they lose 3, you gain 3, but you have a way of making it so when they lose life, they lose extra life. They say they lose the 4, you'll actually gain the 4, not just the 3, whereas if it was worded the other way, you'd only gain the 3. So, interesting card. Not super powerful, right? It definitely wants to be in just the right deck because it doesn't impact the board in any way, shape, or form. You need a lot of mana, you need gaining life to matter, and you need being able to hit them in the face with damage to matter. Maybe a Rakdos burn deck or something? Excuse me. God. I need more coffee. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Zimone Paradox Sculptor. This is 4 mana for a 1/4 legendary human wizard in the colors of Simic. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures that you control. You can also pay 2 mana in the colors of Simic, tap Zimone, double the number of each kind of counter on up to 2 target creatures and or artifacts you control. So right out of the gate, you're meant to think to use this with +1/+1 counter tribal, like those style of decks that are going super deep into +1/+1 counters. You get value at the beginning of combat. You get to exponentially increase how many counters your guys have with the tap ability. But the interesting part of this card to me is the fact that it doubles the number of each counter on a card, not just +1/+1 counters. So it can also hit artifacts, right? So if you have artifacts or creatures, but especially artifacts that are piling up counters of some type, getting to double those counters actually seems kind of interesting. The calendar that we got in the Ixalan set comes to mind. Doubling that and then tapping it to double itself again seems like it could be a thing. A bit of a meme, a bit of a jank sort of idea. But there's potential there for stuff like that, right? If you have ways of putting a bunch of counters on things that really matters way more than +1/+1 counters on a creature, now you have a way to double those counters, which seems nuts. But what's really cool about this too is use it with the doll, right? The doll that we got in Duskmourn, the 1 green and 1, taps for mana of any color, puts a nest counter on it, Twitching Doll. You could use this with Twitching Doll, double all of the different kinds of counters on Twitching Doll, and exponentially increase how many spiders you can make in the process, because it doubles the nest counters, it doubles +1/+1 counters you're putting on it. If you manage to get any other kind of counters on the Twitching Doll, it'll double all those counters. You can come out of nowhere, double all of the different types of counters on your Twitching Doll, sack it, make an absolute board full of spiders, and go ham. And there's probably other examples of ways to abuse this card. If you have ideas, definitely let me know in the comments. I feel like the potential is pretty high for something like this. But it's also really slow, so I don't know if it makes the cut in Standard. I get excited to brew around stuff like this, but I don't know how competitively viable it will actually be. Next up, we've got Blasphemous Edict. This, I think, will be competitive viable. This is 2 black and 3 for a sorcery, but you can pay 1 black rather than pay the spell's mana cost if there are 13 or more creatures on the battlefield, period. Each player sacrifices 13 creatures of their choice. This card's nuts. Now, on first inspection, it seems kind of bad, right? Because if you're playing this in a control deck, you have to wait until your opponent gets to 13 creatures in order to get the cost reduction. And if you're not getting the cost reduction, it is kind of overcosted. That being said, it does get around indestructible and stuff like that, forcing them to sacrifice, which is nice. I think where this card gets really good is in sacrifice decks. If you're getting to 13, not only because your opponent's playing creatures and upticking that, you know, that journey to 13 threshold, but if you're also playing a bunch of creatures that you want to sacrifice, you can get to that 13 threshold way quicker. Play this for just 1 mana, they sack their board, you sack your board, not only do you get rid of their board, but you get all of your death triggers off all your sacrifice creatures that you'd want to sacrifice anyway. So maybe that's a way to get insane value off of this. Essentially have a 1 mana sweeper in the right deck. As long as you can get value off of your own stuff dying, it helps you contribute to building up that number and get to 13 quicker, and still make it worth playing. So kind of love the idea of brewing around that with this card. So I don't know, do you have a better way of using this card? Do you agree with me that that might be the best way of using this card? Do you have any ideas of things you'd want to pair this with that make it absolutely insane? Let me know in the comments. I kind of love it. But next up, we've got Authority of the Consuls coming back to standard. Kinda nuts. Just 1 white mana for an enchantment. Creatures your opponents control enter tapped, and whenever a creature an opponent controls enters, you also gain a life. This is nuts in the Lifegain decks. Being able to slow down your opponent, get rid of all of their blockers by making their creatures enter tapped, completely shut down haste tribal decks for just 1 white mana seems pretty good. But then every single time they play a creature, you get a life gain trigger. You get to tick up your Ajani's Pridemates and all the similar cards. This card could be nuts. It could be nuts. I have a hard time envisioning what this card looks like in standard and how relevant it ends up being, but this has been a very relevant card in the past in certain formats, so I like seeing it come to standard here. I like having the potential of this being a real thing that impacts that meta. Man, it's gonna be really fun to brew this set. But next up, we've got Raise the Past, probably the most busted and my favorite card I think that we've seen in this whole video. This is 2 white and 2 for a sorcery. Return all creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, speaking of sacrifice decks, if you're going wide with a whole bunch of creatures that you want to die, and then you're sacrificing them all, maybe to a Pitiless Carnage, or who knows, whatever sacrifice outlets you have, and then just jam this for 4 mana, and just bring them all back. Not only all of the ones that you recently sacrificed, but all of the creatures you've lost for the whole game that went to the battlefield, or went to the graveyard from the battlefield. Assuming that they're all 2-drops or less, right? You want to build this into a deck where you're just doubling down on all of these cheap go-wide creatures. This might be insane in some kind of a Boros Convoke style deck, as long as you're not too heavily tilted towards tokens. You do want actual creatures. But man, if you can go wide with creatures, and if you have a way of making sure those creatures end up in the graveyard and give you the value so that you get even more value off playing this card, this could be absolutely, utterly absurd. It does still have to contend with Sunfall being in the meta, which is just a problem for so many cards. Why did they print Sunfall? It's so annoying. It's so overpowered. Exile sweepers should just not be a thing. It's just too much. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. I think this card has the potential to be bananas. To be absolutely bananas. Especially if you play it in a deck where maybe everything is 1 or 2 drops with something like Arabella, but then you're also running Enduring Courage. Like everything comes in with haste, swings, Arabella gets her trigger. That could be utterly insane. I love this card. Am I overpraising this? Am I thinking it's too good? Let me know in the comments if you agree. I just think the card is bonkers. But that brings us to our last card of the day. This is Elenda, Saint of Dusk, a 4/4 legendary vampire knight for 4 mana in the colors of Orzhov. And if you weren't convinced that life gain was going to be a real thing in standard moving forward, this card should finally do that. It's a 4/4 lifelinker with hexproof from instants for 4 mana. That means at the very least, they're not going to be able to kill it the turn you play it. Even if they're holding up instant speed interaction, there are very few things that can target this at instant speed and get rid of it that isn't an actual instant. So you have this sort of built-in protection. Comes down as a 4/4 lifelinker for 4, and then as long as your life total is greater than your starting life total, which is kind of easy to do in a life gain deck, even if you're just at 21, that's all it takes. Elenda gets +1/+1 and has Menace, so it becomes a 5/5 lifelink Menace for 4, which is insane, with hexproof from instance still. So even if you say go, and they can untap and use their removal on their turn. If their removal is in the form of instants, they still can't cast it at even sorcery speed to kill your thing, which is crazy. And most of the removal these days is in the form of instants. So the more I think about this card, the crazier I think it is. Like, everybody's running so much instant speed removal because they're worried about the mono red prowess style decks and needing to kill like key creatures at instant speed in response to buff and that sort of thing. This could kind of turn that on its head and be really good. But anyway, back to the other ability. If it Elenda gets an additional +5/+5 as long as your life total is at least 10 greater than your starting life total. So comes down, is almost always going to be a 5/5 lifelink menace creature with hexproof from instants for 4 mana. Crazy top end for the life gain decks. But then she becomes a 10/10 lifelink menace with hexproof from instants for only the 4 mana if you make it to 30 life, in standard at least. More than that in commander, but I digress. Man, she is powerful. She is really, really powerful. The only real question when it comes to this card is she maybe a bit too win more in those decks? She does take a full 4 mana to get down, and those decks tend to be very efficient with the way that they curve out. So it is possible this is win more. It's also possible that this just comes down and is an absolute back-breaking, game-ending threat that your opponent just can't deal with because all of his removal are in the form of instants. And that gets wild to think about. The menace means they have to double block it. They lose 2 blockers when you swing. You gain 10 life. Oh god. The more I think about this card, the more I think it's absolutely insane. We're definitely going to brew with this as the top end of a life gain deck for sure. I think this card might be nuts. It still possibly has the chance of just being too cute and to win more. But I'm leaning more towards this just being nuts. Like, they use up all their removal on everything else, then you jam this and have this monstrous must-answer threat that not only are they probably out of removal for, but is way harder to even target even if they're not. I don't know. I love it. I love Elenda coming back flavor-wise, and I think this card is awesome. But that's going to do it for today. As if that wasn't enough, over an hour and a half going over all of these spoilers. Just so many to cover. But we are up to date, and I'll keep more coming. I've got, there's more spoilers coming for the rest of the Foundation set, as well as there's another video I'm putting together that covers the starter set for Foundations, which contains a whole bunch of standard legal reprints that aren't in the actual Foundation set, so they won't be a part of the draft boosters. You won't be able to play with them in draft or worry about them showing up in draft, but there are a ton of standard legal cards coming down the line in this starter set that add even more to standard. Standard is going to be insane, so look forward to that video. And thanks for checking out this one. Please hit the like button. Helps me get the video out to more people. I would appreciate it so much. It's a lot of work putting these together. I'm exhausted. I'm parched. I need to go drink something and have a meal. But then I am getting online for a stream for Halloween. This is going live on Halloween night. So if you're sitting at home looking for something to do, gorging your face with candy, come on over to twitch.tv/quarantinecapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. And we got tons of crazy stuff planned. So I'll see you there, and I'll see you tomorrow for another spoiler video. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Wonders of the First. Wonders of the First is a brand new collectible card game similar to games like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, featuring a unique action-based resource economy that helps avoid pitfalls like Mana Flood or Mana Screw, and a battlefield containing multiple realms that unlock over time as you fight for control of the stones. The first 400 card set is called Existence and will launch to retail in the fall, but playtest team starter kits are available to order now. And they haven't forgotten about all you collectors out there. The game contains alternate borderless art variants, as well as highly sought after limited edition numbered prints, culminating in a 1-of-1 stone foil. And the best part is that the developers have a community first approach, with 8 print and play decks available on their website, as well as a version of the game available on Tabletop Simulator, all for free. For more information, be sure to check out wondersccg.com today. That's wondersccg.com. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.